lecturer at Monash University, and he's also very close to finish his PhD, right? So it's really a pleasure to have him. His talk is going to be about assessing interactional competence. So over to you, David.
So thanks, Chaba. So I'll start sharing my screen. So Chaba, are you seeing the slide or the presenter view? The slide, right? Cool, awesome, thanks. Yeah, so thanks very much for the introduction and for inviting me to your research launch. So as Shaba said, I'm David Wei Dai, and I'm from Monash University, Australia. So the talk today I'm giving is on assessing second language interactional competence, which is my PhD project, and more specifically, we'll be looking at what everyday life domain experts can inform us of the assessment criteria. And I'll be explaining what I mean by everyday life domain experts in a second. And I will also, but before that, I will talk about what assessing interactional competence and interactional competence are. So in terms of speaking assessment, there are mainly two perspectives. The first one is the psycholinguistic individualist approach, which is very common in major language tests. I think we're all very familiar with this kind of criteria commonly used in language assessment like IELTS. So a psycholinguistic individualist approach focuses on individual speaker and looks at speaking as a process that can be dissected into different components, such as fluency, lexical range, grammar, pronunciation. So these are all indicators of your fluency, but they don't really look at how your speech affects the other person. And when we think about it, speaking is rarely a monologue. You're always talking with someone. So it's always an interactional, a co-constructed process. And so it's a bit weird that speaking assessment doesn't really take into consideration the effect of your speech or your language on other people or on the social interactional context. And the different approach is the sociolinguistic interactional approach, which foregrounds the social context and the fact that speaking is always interactional. So this approach focuses on the purpose of interaction, like why are you speaking, what kind of goals you're trying to achieve, the appropriateness of your language. Are you using language that is suitable for the context or suitable for the person you're talking to? The effects your language has on interlocutors. This is going more towards pragmatics here. And of course, the situational and social context of your language use. So, so instead of, let's say, just focusing on criteria of your speech, like fluency or accuracy, the sociolinguistic interactional approach looks at how you are using language to achieve social goals. And interactional competence is following this sociolinguistic interactional approach. By interactional competence, or IC, what we mean is the competence necessary for effective interaction and the competence that is available in the interaction between participants. So it's co-constructed and it focuses on effective communication. So far, I see researchers mainly draw on conversation analysis to understand how interaction unfolds. So conversation analysis is a field of study that looks specifically at how interaction happens through very minute inspection on conversational data. And I see assessment researchers have looked at a range of indicators that can index speakers' IC. So some of the speakers, some of the indicators are turn taking. So how people take turns. So if I'm, talking with Chabat and I say something and he says something else, so how the speakership transfers, and like self-repair. If I say something that the other person doesn't understand, how do I, correct myself? I say, what I meant was, sorry, what did you say? So this kind of language can resolve interactional troubles. And attentive listening, like I'm showing I'm actually with the other person when I speak. So, and also when the other person talks. So I'm like, yeah, keep going. So kind of like, in a way moves the conversation, which is also related to progressivity. Like how do we make sure the conversation actually flows? How do we expand the turns? And there are many other IC indicators. But this issue with the IC markers or indicators we've looked so far, because most of them are indexing the mechanics of interaction. So when we think about it, it's mainly the sequential property of talk, like how talk unfolds. But interaction and communication are actually a lot more than that. If we revisit Dale Harm's original conceptualization of communicative competence, we can see he actually incorporates a much wider range of volitional, affective, and attitudinal factors in a person's communicative competence. So this is quoted from Harm's 1972. The competence which he meant in communicative competence, moreover, is integral with attitudes, values, and motivations concerning language, its features and uses, and integral with competence for and attitudes towards the interrelation of language with the other code of communicative conduct. So what he meant here is there's a wide range of volitional, attitudinal, and other non-cognitive aspects of communication. They have been theoretically discussed in related fields such as sociology, but they haven't really been incorporated in language assessment. And IC assessment also hasn't really paid enough attention to these more social or categorical aspect of talk. So now the question is, okay, so we know we should probably, it will be a good idea to assess interactional competence and kind of move a little bit away from the more traditional psycholinguistic individualist approach. But the question here is, what kind of assessment criteria should we use for IC assessment, given that there's so many potential indicators, right? Because interaction is so complex. One way of language testing researchers use to arrive at the rating criteria in a rating rubric is to use experts' judgment on what should be assessed. So traditionally, we use linguists, language teachers, or test examiners' judgment, and they say, okay, we should be assessing pronunciation, or we should be assessing fluency. But that's largely relying on specialists' knowledge, and they also have a lot of training in linguistics. The issue here is these language specialists don't really represent how test takers don't really represent the people that test takers actually interact in real life. Because when you think about it, we take TOEFL but we don't just go to an English speaking country and only interact with linguists or language teachers. We interact with everyday people. But everyday people's opinion of language competency hasn't really been incorporated in the assessment criteria. To address this issue, in some language testing topics, researchers have used domain experts' indigenous criteria. What they mean by domain experts is people who are professionals in that particular domain. And indigenous criteria is their internal or innate understanding of how communication should happen in that particular field. So some examples can be aviation language, right? If you want to know how pilots talk, then probably it makes more sense to actually talk to pilots and understand what they consider to be effective communication. If you want to understand how health professionals communicate in the hospital or in clinical settings, it probably makes more sense to interview doctors and nurses rather than linguists, right? So this is what is meant by domain experts, because they're actually experts in their respective domains. And Sato McNamara 2018 reports a study that used linguistic laypersons to inform them of the everyday criteria that everyday people use in everyday communication. So what they did was they want to understand what English as a lingua franca communication happens in real life and what kind of criteria people usually use for ELF communication. So they interviewed linguistic laypersons. What they mean by that is people who are users of English as a lingua franca, but they're not trained in linguistics, and to elicit their understanding of what makes effective ELF communication. This, in a way, prompted the study I'm reporting today. I'm also, in a way, using linguistic laypersons to inform me of the criteria for a test that I've developed. But instead of calling them linguistic laypersons, I've decided to call them everyday life domain experts, because these people are competent users of the language in the test domain that my test is situated in, and the domain is everyday life interaction. So I wanted to acknowledge everyday people's expertise and knowledge in everyday interaction. So the research questions are, what are everyday life domain experts' indigenous criteria of interactional success in everyday settings? And second, can domain experts' indigenous criteria be located in and explained by test takers' performances? So the second question, in a way, is actually addressing a test validation issue. If we say this test is measuring certain abilities, we need to be able to prove that test takers' performance actually reflect the abilities we claim to be assessing, right? Otherwise, the test is not valid. You say, like, you say your test is actually measuring proficiency, but when we look at speakers' performance, we can't really see any indicators of, let's say, fluency or accuracy, then the test is not really valid. So that's the purpose of the second question. I'll be very quick on methodology here. So the instrument is a 9-item role play IC, interactional competence test. And the participants are everyday life domain experts. The test is a second language Chinese test. So the everyday life domain experts I recruited are first language Chinese speakers who have only lived in China, and they've worked and studied in China. They have a lot of understanding of how everyday interaction happens in China. And I've also had native, so L1 Chinese and L2 Chinese test takers. Their performance is used as a stimuli for domain experts to comment, to elicit, for me to elicit their criteria. And so I got the domain experts to listen to speech samples and write comments, and then I conducted focus group interviews with them. I coded both sources of data. After that, I conducted CA and MCA analysis on the transcripts to gain a more refined understanding of how interaction unfolds. So these are so here I've reported 5 rating categories of IC that I've derived from these domain experts' comments. So I've listed the number of codes for each category and the percentage of the codes out of the entirety of the codes. So this is the test, and the TT here stands for test taker. So we have firstly, disaffiliation management. I should mention the test taps into test takers' ability to manage pretty tricky interpersonal situations, such as, for example, I'm just making one up off the top of my head here. Like, let's say you told your PhD supervisor you will meet him at 3 p.m. for a supervision meeting, but you want to cancel 1 minute before that. How do you do that without ruining the relationship you have with your supervisor? So something like a bit tricky here. And obviously you need to manage the disaffiliation here. Disaffiliation can be roughly understood. It's a CA concept, but it roughly can, it's about, it can be you can understand it as like a face-threatening activities, like things that can damage interpersonal relations. So obviously you need to manage that to de-escalate the tension. And at the same time, so disaffiliation management is about kind of like mitigating the damaging impact your speech will have on the relationship you have with the other person. And affiliative resources is kind of like addressing this issue from a different angle, which is to actively promote social solidarity. Like, what can you say or do to repair the relationship you have with your supervisor? And we also have reasoning, which is the logic of your talk. Is your talk actually making sense? Can your argument be sufficiently substantiated? And we have morality, which is the moral character or the moral order of interaction that is evidenced through your talk. Because every time we talk, we are kind of like inviting other people to make a moral judgment of ourselves. So if we just do a no show up with our supervisor for a very important meeting, our supervisor might think, we're not being very, I guess, punctual or reliable. So that's a moral judgment. So how do you present yourself as a moral being in society? And finally, we have role enactment, which is also a CA concept, but it's fairly, in a way, it's actually quite commonsensical in the sense that every time we talk as a specific, we're talking a particular social role, right? If we talk with our supervisor, we talk like a student. If we talk to our doctor, we talk as a patient. If we talk to our friends, we talk, we're being a friend. So you need to make sure your language actually reflects the social role you're undertaking. So that's also the reason I put it here on the top, because role enactment is like a higher order ability here. And I've also connected these categories with the artistic proofs in philosophy, in Aristotle's philosophy. So in a way, disaffiliation management, affiliative resources are kind of like addressing interaction from an emotional perspective. So they are related. So in a way, they're reflecting your pathos. And we have reasoning, which is very similar to logos, and morality is similar to Aristotle's concept of ethos. So we can see the construct not only represent CA's understanding of interaction, they also in a way mirror more classic conceptualizations of how interpersonal communication happens. And through these 5 categories, we can look at test takers' performance in a test, and then we arrive at, let's say, a score of their interactional competence here, which is IC at the top. So to make it a bit more, to actually make it a bit more, I guess, vivid, now I'm going to show you some test taker performance so that we can better understand how these rating categories are reflected in test taker data, which is also the second research question, right? So if we want to claim that a test actually measures certain criteria, we need to be able to identify them in test taker performance. So here is one of the items in my test. So this is the test taker U. The test taker is gonna relocate to a different city because of work. So he's temporarily subletting his apartment to his best friend Wang Hao's son, Wang Bing here. However, when the test taker is on a business trip, he or she got a call from their building, like a property manager, telling them that there's been a lot of noise in their apartment, and their neighbors, the test taker's neighbors, are not very happy with it, and they're seeing a lot of like a drunken, youth coming in and out of the apartment at really, weird hours. So the test taker decided to have a video chat with, the interlocutor, which is their friend's son. And now we're going to look at 2 test takers' performance here, and we won't be able to look at all 5 rating categories, but we'll look at some of them. So the first performance comes from a native speaker. I here stands for interlocutor, and T stands for test taker. So the interlocutor is a native L1 Chinese native speaker who is role-playing the test taker's friend's son. And this is the native speaking test taker here. And I'll play the recording, and the recording is in Chinese. And this is, so I've translated in to English. And as the recording plays, I will move the cursor along the transcript so you can have a rough idea. If you don't understand Chinese, you can have a rough idea of what they're talking about. The translation is lightly transcribed in CA fashion. And some of the red parts are the parts I would like to direct your attention to. So let's get started.
就是叔叔会不会觉得是不是邻居太敏感了？
就是不管邻居多敏感，这个是我家，我回去的时候还是要遭到邻居的白眼的，就是你要为我着想一点。
那我会稍微注意一下吧。行，不好意思啊，给叔叔添麻烦。
So remember I said earlier that domain experts made comments on test takers' performance. So the domain experts that look at this particular excerpt mentioned this test taker was actually not performing very well. He was being quite aggressive, and he basically made the interaction impossible to continue. And we can see here pretty clearly, even without going to the minute details, that the interlocutor actually didn't know how to respond. And they're also saying this person is not really talking in a role that is suitable, in the test scenario, because this test taker is supposed to be the interlocutor's in a way. So he's the interlocutor's father's friend. So this is not the way you talk to your best friend's son, right? Telling them that what they're doing is really bad. They're bringing shame or contempt, for the test taker. So and we can see the test taker didn't really manage this affiliation at all. He was in a way actually escalating it by using strong words like contempt, or this is my house. You have to obey my rules. This kind of language. So if we are rating this performance against traditional psycholinguistic individualist, let's say, frameworks, we will say, oh, this test taker is actually doing really well. He used very complex language like contempt. Not many L2 Chinese speakers will be able to use this kind of words here. And also he used, the grammar is perfect, intonation is good, pronunciation is, perfect as well. But when we think about the broader interactional or social context, and when we can see clearly that his talk is not really appropriate, and that's verified by domain experts' comments. So here I'm mainly focusing on the role enactment and disaffiliation management criteria. And let's look at another performance sample. This is from a second language Chinese speaker, Eric. He is, if we use CEFR, proficiency framework, he's probably at B1 or B2, so around intermediate. And he managed the conversation in a very different fashion, and domain experts commented very positively on his performance. So let's have a listen together.
会不会是邻居他们太敏感了？觉得
太敏感，也许是这样啊，我有点同意，但是我们不能选择我们的邻居，也有规律吧。
好，那我以后会注意的，不好意思，麻烦叔叔了，您还在出场。
没问题，
So here, domain experts said this person is actually, very friendly, very measured, very understanding, and they really like the explanation or reason he offered. here, like to say, oh, we can't really choose our neighbors, so they think it's a very good reason. And when we look more closely into let's say, into some of the linguistic features, we can already see clearly that there are like hesitation markers, like or kind of like searching for words. So again, if you're using traditional psycholinguistic individualist rating scales, this person probably wouldn't score very high on, let's say, accuracy, complexity, or even fluency, lexical range, or all of those criteria. But using more socially grounded criteria, domain experts actually think he's doing quite well. So let's look a bit more closely into the interactional data here. So this is transcribed in CA fashion. The first line is the Chinese transcript, and the second line is the grammar gloss, and the last line is the English translation. So let's look at the first two lines. So that's from the interlocutor, and the interlocutor in a way was trying to push back a little bit by saying, oh, I don't think it's my fault. I think the neighbor's being too sensitive here, and see what the test taker says. And the test taker obviously in the end said, in line 5, said, we can't choose our neighbors. So Eric was disagreeing with, in a way, like a saying no, or disagreeing with what the interlocutor was trying to imply. But before he offered the disagreement proper, there's actually a substantial amount of agreement preceding it. And this is a very common format in disagreements. Before you disagree, you first say something positive, or say some agreeing, I guess, elements to mitigate the damage that your disagreeing act can have on the interpersonal relations. So, and when we look closely into this agreement part using CA, we can see it actually has 3 affiliative moves. So the first one is, so he first said, the test taker first said, oh, too sensitive. So this is recycling what the interlocutor said beforehand, like too sensitive. So in a way, he's acknowledging what the person said beforehand. It's like a receipt of the information before, and say, okay, I hear you, I'm with you. So it's kind of maintaining intersubjectivity, like we are kind of like, sharing this together. I'm with you at the moment, showing that he's actually paying attention. And then he said, oh, maybe it is like that. So this is affiliating. I mean, kind of like, trying to bring the relationship closer, but it is affiliating epistemically. So from a knowledge domain perspective, what I mean by epistemically is, when we think about the roles of the two people here, the test taker is actually, used to live there for a very long time. So he, if any, he should be the one who knows a lot more about his, he or she, his neighbor's dispositions, right? So he could have said something like, I don't think that's the case. My neighbors are all very nice. I don't think they're being too sensitive here. And many test takers actually said that. But instead, he said, maybe it is like that. So he's actually acknowledging the interlocutor, the kid's claim to the knowledge domain here by saying, what you said, can be true, can be factual, perhaps. So I'm not just negating, your claim to the knowledge domain here. And then he said, Eric said, I agree with you somewhat. So this is also affiliating, but it is affiliating more effectively at a more emotional level. I agree with you. I support you. I'm kind of like trying to relate to you on an emotional, effective level. So the 3 steps obviously, helped with buffering the disagreement proper that is forthcoming. And we can even see some little, cues here that disagreement is coming up, like, oh, maybe it is like that. Oh, I agree with you somewhat. So they're all qualified. But because of the extensive amount of affiliative work here, when we hear this disagreement proper, it's not really that damaging, or it's not really such a heavy blow, and when we, inspect closer what he said, it's actually very, he was actually, very smart. He said, oh, the thing is we can't choose our neighbors. So he's not saying, I think you're wrong. He's not criticizing him. He's not saying, you're misbehaving, you're bringing, contempt, for me or anything. He just said, we can't choose our neighbors. It's like a very commonsensical. It's resulting to, it's not blaming the other person. It's a no blame account. So by doing this, he actually, relieves the test take, the other person from kind of like from a morally, I guess, contestable situation. So that's also what the domain experts mean by saying this person has, is very smart or has very strong reasoning skills, because he thought about the situation and came up with the best solution here. And when we look at the ensuing interaction, we can see the work that the test taker did, the affiliation, the careful choice of explanation or reason to push back really worked very well to make the conversation flow. So this is from the interlocutor. And he said, oh, in that case, I'll be more careful in the future. I'm really sorry for, troubling you, especially when you're still on a business trip. So this is very different if we can still remember how the interlocutor responded to the native speaker earlier. Like the interlocutor at that time was like, I don't know what, he didn't really know what to say. But here, everything just flows very naturally because things were kind of like, in a way, so because Eric, the test taker, prepared the interlocutor for what is coming up and interact, the social solidarity was maintained and strengthened by all the, affiliative work he did. And we can see test taker here, Eric here, still is, in a way, always with the interlocutor and proffering, aligning tokens here, so get the other person to keep talking. And he also overlapped with the other person when, the interlocutor said, I feel bad, you're still on business trip and I'm causing you so much trouble. And the test taker quickly said, oh, that's no problem at all. So kind of like quickly dispelling any concerns the interlocutor might have. So here we can see like a mutual work at preserving social solidarity. So first of all, the test taker did a lot of work. And then the interlocutor also tried hard to maintain this, a positive vibe. And while he's doing that, the test taker, Eric, kept proffering affiliative tokens to maintain this, solidarity or positive vibe. So to conclude, this project I'm working on, in a way, is trying to specify a test construct that is built on everyday life members' natural attitude towards the common sense world. So it's not kind of like, the criteria are not being imposed by, linguists or language teachers. We're actually looking at how interaction is being perceived and oriented to by everyday people. And the construct tried to cover a broader range of IC indicators, not just the sequential indicators like turn taking. The construct look at the social, categorical, moral aspects of talk, which are also aligned with many sociological and philosophical models that have been proposed, like Delheim's communicative competence or Aristotle's artistic proofs. And we can see from the data that the IC indicators or rating criteria are empirically verifiable. We can see that in the interactional data, and these are also the features that raters or domain experts can actually observe. And as I mentioned earlier, it resembles the original communicative competence model proposed by Delheim. And finally, this model of assessing interaction has the potential to destabilize native speakers' privileges. Because when we, just from the two excerpts we look at, we can see the native speaker actually didn't perform that well. Yes, if we use traditional psycholinguistic individualist rating criteria, native speakers are always the gold standard. But when we talk about interaction or the ability to interact effectively or appropriately, then native speakers are no longer the benchmark, because we all know, we all speak one or two languages as our first language. I'm sure we all know someone who also speaks the language as their first language, but somehow just manages to step on everyone's toes, right? So the native speakers are not always the best communicators. So by shifting from measuring linguistic competence or the psycholinguistic model of speaking to a model that captures the different dimensions of the interaction, we are empowering second language speakers and acknowledging their interactional competence. And these are the references, and that's the end of my talk. Thanks.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. So normally what happens is we open it up for discussions, questions. So if you have questions, you can either unmute yourself and ask the question, or you can, if you're really shy, then you can also type it in the chat box, which I will be monitoring, and then I will read them out. But if you have questions, then now is the time. While others are thinking of their questions, I had a question during the presentation. It's super complex and super academic question, right? So did you actually do the drawings?
Sorry, did I actually do the drawing? Oh yeah, that was my drawing, yeah.
They're fabulous, really nice.
Thanks.
Good. Cool. Any questions from the audience or comments, suggestions?
Or anything I didn't explain very clearly?
I know we have some undergraduate students in the audience as well. So if something wasn't clear, this is the time to ask it. Hello, Jess Price.
Hi, I've got a quick question. You probably did cover this, but I maybe wasn't fully paying attention at the time. But how did you decide how things fitted in the different codes that you identified? What was your kind of coding criteria?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So what I did was I used traditional content like thematic analysis. So started from the transcripts and those experts' written comments, and just start from identifying codes and then collapse them into themes and then categories and super categories. So it's very bottom up, and I try to use their own language. Like they might say something like, "Oh, this person's language is very warm," or this person is kind of like talking in kind of like is showing respect, or so kind of these kind of like non-linguistic language, but still represents their judgment of the interaction.
I find your talk really interesting. So it was really interesting hearing your perspective and the work that you've been doing.
Thanks so much. Sorry, what did you? Was that another question you asked? Or?
No, it was just that, just to clarify how you did the coding.
Cool.
Yes, Daniel.
Hi, David. I'm still in the process of waking up, so forgive me if I don't make sense. But first of all, thank you very much. I love your thinking around IC and expanding the construct, and especially bringing in different elements from different disciplines, including philosophy, and really expanding how we conceive or how we conceptualize the construct. So in relation to that, I'm listening to all that, I was just thinking when we involve domain experts, and as conversation analysts, I think we're quite, and working in IC research, we're quite used to the sort of collaborative orientation of interaction. And we tend to think that, that is maybe the gold standard, or maybe something that we should work towards when we talk about L2 interactional competence development or assessment. I wonder if any of your domain expert participants kind of think to the other extreme and thinking that, okay, the orientation or the goal should really be sort of winning the argument, for example. So maybe did any of them show a different interpretation of how to manage disaffiliation, for example? Did they think, some of them think that, okay, actually escalating the disagreement and actually winning the argument over the other person should be the direction to go to, and and that shows more of a higher level of competence in a way?
That's a really good question, and yes, you are right. So there was definitely disagreement, within the domain experts, because when we talk about pragmatics, it's always so can be very subjective to a certain extent. So yes, that's also the reason why I recruited quite a lot of domain experts. I had 36 of them. So that kind of represents, yeah. So in a way, I try to incorporate different perspectives, and in a way, and also the criteria are not really, they're open to interpretation. For example, like disaffiliation management, how you manage it, obviously is up to your discretion, but usually people do have a commonsensical, I guess, criterion for how much you can escalate. And that's also in a way circumscribed by the task. So if the task asks you to, let's say, launch a highly disaffiliative action to your manager, then there's only so far you can go before it becomes, I guess, really worrying, right? So I guess there are parameters in place to, because we have to remember it's a language testing setting. So the tasks in a way also set parameters for how far you can go.
Yeah, completely agree. I imagine if the stakes are different, let's say if the domain experts or the test takers are in that real situation where they have to sort of maybe push the tenant out, maybe then what is considered competence would be very different from this situation in this task.
Yeah, definitely. So that's why I had this, this tenant is actually your best friend's son. So that's why people be like, oh, there's only you can only go that far before you actually also, ruin your relationship with your best friend.
Yes.
So yeah, that needs to be taken into account to some extent, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you.
No worries.
Any other questions or suggestions, comments?
Hi, David.
Oh, hi.
Just curious in terms of how you picked, what are the person's background? But there's a term that you used. I forgot the term. So sorry. The one that you said was judging their interactional competence. The person categorizing, I forgot what was it. But my question is, because in how certain contexts, like this is building onto David's question, where how different people perceive different competence on an extreme end, right? So in different cultures around the world, some like people prefer banter and things like that. On some cultures, more direct. So I'm just curious as to what are the social backgrounds of that, the rater? Yeah.
Yeah, that's a really, really good question. And as I said earlier, pragmatic assessment, whenever we talk about appropriateness, it always becomes a bit fuzzy because the standards are never really standardized. But if we narrow the domain you know, a little bit, the test actually becomes feasible. So for example, to answer your question, for my test, it was really targeting second language Chinese. And the domain experts I recruited are all first language speakers of Chinese and Mandarin Chinese. So it's not other varieties. And they're all, let's say, living in fairly metropolitan cities in China, so that they represent a certain socioeconomic, I guess, background. And that's justified for my particular test, because the test taker population I'm aiming at are people who are likely to learn Chinese to live, work, and study in China. And the majority of them wouldn't really, I guess, you know, relocate to rural areas, or maybe, you know, so they'll probably be most likely speaking Mandarin and living in big cities. So I guess whenever we kind of like, you know, elicit or derive rating criteria for specific language tests, we need to think about the real world application. Like, what is the test actually designed for? So let's say if we're now designing a language test for, let's say, testing Vietnamese as a second language, but in a very specific context, then we need to choose our domain experts accordingly. And I'm not saying the criteria I came up with here are universally applicable. It's only for this very particular context. So it probably needs to be, they need to be verified against different contexts.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed your talk.
Thank you.
I have a question. For some reason, for my colleague, Dr. Wong, the Zoom is not really working. She can hear us, but she can't do anything. So I will ask the questions on her behalf. So her question is, what instruction was given to the raters, and were they told to focus on a specific area?
Yeah, there's so many awesome questions here. Yeah. Yes. Again, a very good question. I was what I asked them. So, like I said earlier, they are domain experts, but they are domain experts of everyday interaction. But at the same time, they are linguistically untrained. So, what I did was ask them to focus on interactional success. So, ask them to just listen to the sample and comment on what they think are, let's say, relevant to interaction, or to relevant, you know, kind of like contributing to how well the interaction unfolded, or kind of like how, you know, how the interaction actually, you know, just, you know, had a, you know, train wreck. So kind of like focusing on these particular features. Yeah. So it was quite open.
Right. And you mentioned that you had 36 raters, like domain experts.
Sorry, Chapa, you're cutting in and out.
Oh, sorry for that. Experts, right?
Oh. Can you hear me?
Is it better now?
I just turned off my camera and see if it works better, or.
Yeah, hopefully. Maybe I will do the same. So you had a number of evaluators, right? Or domain experts.
Yes.
How varied was their rating?
Yes. So I didn't really, like I said earlier, I didn't really try to, I guess, push them to agree. I just elicited their comments and opinions, and then I coded their comments. But, you know, if you're interested, I can, you know, quickly tell you that, I mean, this obviously is just one part of my project. So later I, you know, designed rating scales based on the criteria and asked raters, I trained raters and asked them to rate test taker performance on these criteria. And the inter and intra-rater reliability is quite high. So obviously this is more moving towards the quantitative phase of test validation, but that, I guess, high reliability shows when raters actually use this rating scale to rate actual test taker performance, their standards are, you know, actually quite consistent. So in a way, because, and that's also in a way understandable, because what you know tends to offend one person from a particular speech community is also likely to offend another person. It wouldn't be that drastic when you have controlled the parameters very tightly.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Very interesting.
Yes, Chapa, I think there's someone that raised their hand earlier. So.
Yes. Who was that?
I think it's XY or YX. Or
Hi.
I think that's Shunyu. Hello,
yeah,
Shunyu.
Wait, can you see me? Do we have time for another question?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
So, thank you very much for your presentation. I learned a lot from your presentation.
Thank you.
I'm wondering whether along the process of planning your research, whether you actually considered getting the participants to be involved. I mean, like maybe doing a simulated recall interview with the test takers, so that you can verify the interpretations from the raters. Is my question clear?
Sorry, you were also cutting in and out a little bit, so I'm not sure I completely got what you were saying. So were you saying if I did, let's say, stimulated recalls with test takers to see if they agree with raters' judgment, or?
Yeah, it could be that, or doing a simulated recall interview to sort of like understand what the intentions are behind what they said, so that then we can verify the what they said, and then with the interpretations of the raters.
That's very interesting, and I think that's definitely a piece of validity evidence, and I think it can support the extrapolation inference in a way by saying, so what test takers are doing in the test are actually what they will be doing in real life. But that's that's good, and I think they should be. I wish I could look into that if I had enough funding, but I didn't. What I did instead was I did ask test takers to rate how, let's say, how they think the test performance reflects what they would do in real life, and there are also other kind of, I guess, quantitative evidence that I elicited to see if test taking performance actually reflects real world behavior, right? Because it doesn't really make sense when you've designed elaborate rating scale and say, oh, this is measuring real life situation and real life behavior, but your test results actually don't give you any reliable, I guess, evidence of how people actually behave in real life. So that's a very good I guess, piece of validity evidence that we can elicit. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any other questions, or?
I have a quick one, if.
Sure.
Oh yeah, I can.
Hi, David. Good talk. My question possibly follows along from whose name I forgot. I'm sorry, the previous person. In terms of is the design of this assuming that you'll be using your lay linguists to create a criteria, and then the markers will then later be hired as sort of experts, teachers or linguists or someone, or would you be hiring lay linguists as the final testers?
Yes, so yes, what I did was the raters I eventually recruited were also, you can call them linguistic lay persons, so they won't really train in linguistics. But in a way, that's also, I mean, of course, the CA concepts are quite esoteric, so I had to simplify them for raters so that they can use the rating scale to rate. But because the rating criteria are not based on, linguistic, meta-linguistic knowledge, it's easier for them to understand the rating scale.
Yeah, so your research was to create those ratings to then give to people. So IELTS is all I know, so I'm going to go with IELTS. Mm-hmm. If this was to become an IELTS equivalent test, would the final testers be your domain experts, so people grading the IELTS test essentially, or would they be a separate set of, say, experts or teachers who had taken a criteria that you developed using these lay linguists?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say So the test takers are foreign language learners, right? I mean, in this case, second language Chinese speakers. And the people that rate their performance would be raters, and they can either be, linguistic experts or domain experts, or kind of, whatever you like to call them, linguistic layperson or everyday life domain experts. But in my research, I use everyday people to rate. But it'll be interesting to look at the rating results from language teachers or IELTS examiners and see, how they compare with everyday people's judgment. Let's say maybe a potential issue there is linguistically, highly linguistically trained people will still unavoidably focus more on linguistic markers and don't really stick to the rating scale. So yeah, that's maybe a follow-up topic. Yeah.
Sorry, my cat just invaded, but thank you for your answer.
Thank you. Okay, I guess we are out of time, unless there is anyone really wanting to ask a final question. But otherwise, I would like to really, really thank you so much, David, for doing this talk for us.
No worries.
And
thanks for inviting me.
You're welcome. It was super nice to have you and have an insight into your research. I shared some of your publication links with my students, so I'm sure you will get some downloads as well. And I wish you good luck for doing the final touches on your thesis, and good luck for whatever that's coming.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And thanks for organizing this. And I think it's a great, like I said earlier, it's a great platform for people to get together and exchange ideas. And I also learned a lot from the questions that are being asked today. They're all really insightful questions and comments. So thanks.
You're always welcome to, join us for other sessions as well.
Cool. Yeah, I'll mark my calendar.
Excellent. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. Thank you again, David, and have a brilliant weekend.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks, guys. Have a good weekend.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Should I just end it?
I think you can, yes.
Just end it? Okay. And then everyone. And thanks everyone for your comments. Thank you. Have a good weekend. If you can, wait a little bit. See if anyone has any other questions. It's pretty safe to go now. Okay, bye Trevor, have a good weekend.
You too, take care, bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.